A real horror experience shared by Asura, a South Korean TV broadcast producer. Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. Thank you for staying up and listening to my story until such a late hour again today. Tonight, I'd like to take my time and tell you, in my own words, about a certain ghost story that actually circulates behind the scenes among broadcasting crews. Perhaps the questions I get asked the most are along these lines. Do broadcasting station ghost stories actually exist? Which network has what kind of story? Have you ever actually seen anything firsthand on set? Whether I'm out having drinks or reading the comments, people ask me about this constantly. To give you the conclusion first, yes, they do exist. However, when I say they exist, I don't mean it in a way that can be flashes of proof like in a movie. It means that on set, there are undeniably moments when things happen that are simply hard to explain. At the same time, I can't completely dismiss the viewer's reactions when they say something feels scripted or staged. After all, television is a product, and a show requires a structured format. But you see, that's not where the real issue lies. Even if you prepare a perfect script and pour everything into editing, there are sets where incidents occur that are simply unairable, and it's not just because it's too scary to broadcast. Whether it's because it's too dangerous or overly graphic, there are various reasons why footage that can never be released gets created. That is why when it comes to occult or paranormal specials, there are so many episodes that get completely shelved and locked away in the vault even after filming is finished. Sometimes the production team on site is split up into different units right from the start. One team to shoot what will actually go on the air, and another team whose sole purpose is to keep a record under the premise that it will never be broadcast. The latter is, so to speak, for archival purposes. In fact, there are organizations both at home and abroad that study or collect paranormal phenomena, and they actively look for that kind of footage. There are even cases where they buy it out saying, "We want to use this as research material." Back then, I was frequently assigned to that off-camera side of the production. That's precisely why I'm sitting on so many stories that have never once been seen on television. Today, out of all those stories, I'll start with a place that is widely famous, just as an introduction. Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. It was even featured as the subject of a movie, so many of you have probably heard the name at least once. However, let me clarify first to avoid any misunderstanding. We didn't film this by trespassing. The place is surrounded by fences, so sneaking in on your own is an automatic strikeout right there. That's why we contacted the property owner, went through all the necessary legal procedures, and obtained official permission before entering. The shooting schedule was set for 3 days. We practically stayed glued to the site day and night, through the dead of night and right into the early dawn. The first day mostly revolved around safety checks and preliminary preparations. Abandoned buildings are hazardous underfoot, littered with broken glass and rusty nails. Our job was to map out the crew's movement paths, position the lights and equipment, and get everything ready for the actual shoot. Additionally, on sets like this, we frequently have a mudang accompany us. This is done to draw a clear line right from the start between places where it's okay to enter and places where you absolutely should not step foot inside. On the second day, we would walk through the building while gathering what we call B-roll and insert shots. We would silently film the exterior, the hallways, the staircases, the doors, the room numbers, and the graffiti, things like that. On the third day, we would set up multiple cameras to capture long takes or conduct what you might call test filming. A rule that often comes into play here is, do not move around in pairs. If crew members stick together in pairs, the people on set will say in all seriousness, they won't show themselves if there are 2 of you. So in the end, the staff members have to divide the sections up and move around completely alone. There were 3 of us who went in, and we split up the building into assigned areas among ourselves. Places like the basement or the rooftop are almost always rumored to be dense with spiritual activity right from the start. Because of that, the air would instantly grow heavy whenever it came down to deciding who would have to go there. That day, I was the one assigned to cover the basement area. As a rule, we were supposed to report our location via radio every time we moved into a new spot, just stating it flatly like, "I'm entering the basement now." However, not even a few minutes after heading in, the radio of one of my colleagues went completely dead. On a set like this, losing contact is a massive red flag in and of itself. The other crew member and I immediately started calling out to him. "Can you hear me? Respond." There was no answer. Instead, a bizarre static began bleeding through the walkie-talkie. It wasn't the usual "curzit" click you get when someone presses the talk button. It sounded more like something wet and damp rubbing against something else right up close. Judging that he must be somewhere nearby, we began moving forward, relying entirely on that sound to guide us. Abandoned ruins possess a strange, unsettling kind of silence. Because there are no people around, even the faintest noise echoes loudly, sounding unnaturally amplified. Right then, even though we were clearly on the second floor, a set of footsteps echoed from the third floor. It wasn't the sound of someone running. It was a dragging sort of walk, a heavy, rhythmic thud, thud. Since the sound was coming from above, we had no choice but to go up. Despite being two grown men, we were so utterly terrified that we held each other's hands tightly as we climbed the stairs. The Gonjiam complex was divided into several different wings, with sections in between that connected them like corridors. Even back then, there was a specific wing that was completely off limits, boarded up and blocked off like a barricade. There are certain areas where the Mudang strictly warns us right from the start, saying, "Do not step foot in there." We had been moving strictly within the permitted safe boundaries, but on the third floor, there was a corridor extending toward another wing. The footsteps had been coming from that corridor side the entire time. At that exact moment, the same thought crossed both my colleague's mind and mine. It's too dangerous for just the two of us to go after this. So, we immediately called the Mudang, who was waiting back at the base lodging. The unspoken rule on sets like this is simple. The moment you get even the slightest bad feeling, call the Mudang. When we explained the situation, the Mudang told us he was already on his way in his car. "I'm coming right now. Stay right there and wait." We held our breath and waited for him around the first floor. Time felt strangely elongated. The moment the Mudang arrived, he didn't waste a single word on pleasantries. "Stay here. I'll bring him back out." With that, he grabbed a radio and bolted up the stairs. Left below, we could do nothing but listen to the audio bleeding through the radio. We heard the heavy thud of his footsteps taking the stairs, and the sound of him calling out the name of our missing colleague. Immediately after that, a low woman's voice cut through the radio. "No!" It was incredibly abrupt. It wasn't a glitch in the hardware, nor was it someone playing a sick prank. It came through crystal clear, undeniably as a human voice. The Mudang seemed to react to the voice, but for the moment, he just kept calling out our colleague's name anyway. And then it happened again. This time, a light, childlike voice bled in. "Don't come." The words were brief, yet for some reason, they felt eerily, unnaturally vivid. At that exact second, the Mudang barked back into his radio. "Why shouldn't I come?" Everything cut off right there. Both the footsteps and the voices vanished in an instant. Nothing but a suffocating silence remained, and ironically, that quietness was the most terrifying part of all. The very next second, the sound of the Mudang sprinting hit the radio. We could also hear his brief, urgent commands like, "Over here, come on!" Then came a flurry of heavy footsteps, scrambling down the stairs as if fleeing for their lives. Before long, the Mudang emerged at the bottom, practically dragging our missing colleague along with him. The color had completely drained from my colleague's face. He was drenched in sweat, breathing erratically, and his eyes were entirely out of focus. Even on the Mudang's face, the usual composure he carried was entirely gone. We decided not to stay at the site for a single second longer. We felt that getting him back to the lodging and helping him calm down had to be our absolute priority. After some time had passed, my colleague finally managed to find his voice. I fully intended to go to the second floor, but by the time I snapped out of it, I was already on the third. The very moment I was climbing the stairs, this sudden, overwhelming urge to go higher just welled up inside me. He said that even though he couldn't explain the reason himself, it felt like a bizarre sense of certainty, and the instant he stepped onto the third floor, someone grabbed him tightly by his right hand. He said it was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The moment she gripped his hand, his memory snapped completely. He had no idea what happened from that point onward. How he had walked, where he had been taken, or how much time had ticked away. He said it was all just a complete hollow blank. We couldn't reach a definitive conclusion right then and there about what had actually happened either. However, one thing was absolutely certain. The fact that he had mentioned the presence of a child. And that voice, the one that had bled through the radio. A few days later, we dug through all the archival materials we could possibly get our hands on. Things like past incidents connected to the building, rumors, and records from that era. As we did, A single record among the stories regarding the third floor caught our attention. It detailed an incident where a male patient who had been admitted there threw his young daughter out from the third floor. Even the age of the child eerily matched the 7 or 8 years old that my colleague had described. Because of that, I can't help but wonder, even to this day, what exactly it was that stopped us in our tracks that night. This isn't a matter of whether you believe it or not. The people who were present on that set undeniably experienced something that grazed past them from the other side, and that experience was simply far too dangerous to ever be put on the air. That is why the footage captured on that day never ended up seeing the light of day. However, that memory remains vividly etched in my mind even now. That is all for the story of Gonjiam. Next, I will move on to another location, the story of the abandoned haunted house in Yeongdeok. Moving on to the story of the Yeongdeok house, many people believe that house famous on the internet is the real deal. However, that isn't the real abandoned Yeongdeok house. That 3-story house frequently seen in photos, located right near the road overlooking the ocean, that is an entirely different property. The real location is another house situated further up, about 100 to 200 meters into the mountainside right behind it. That one is what you would call the real abandoned Yeongdeok house. Of course, the house famous in the photos has its own share of rumors, and I am not saying it's a place with absolutely no history. In fact, there was a period in the past when a mudang lived there, and another period when someone running a restaurant inhabited the place. Because of that, we did our field reporting, tracked down phone numbers to conduct interviews, and carried out a considerable amount of preliminary research. However, stories like everyone who visited there died, or even the mudang couldn't stomach it and fled, are highly exaggerated. While it is true that people have passed away there were cases with perfectly grounded reasons, such as old age or accidents. Attributing all of those instances to the work of spirits is pushing the narrative a bit too far. Furthermore, broadcasting stations fundamentally cannot film anything without prior permission. If the owner of a location says no, that is the end of it. That is why negotiations are vital, to the point where there are people in the industry who specialize exclusively in location scouting and securing permissions. The real abandoned Yeongdeok house is a weathered-looking 2-story building, and oddly enough, even though there's a restroom inside the house, there's another separate one outside. And in the basement, there is a space that looks like a boiler room. When you're on a shoot at an abandoned property, honestly, the basement is the place everyone wants to film the most. It delivers the perfect atmosphere, and basements are usually where people claim something is down there. So when we went out for our preliminary site scouting, the first thing we did was look for an entrance to the basement. As we walked around the exterior capturing B-roll, we spotted a door and a set of stairs leading down toward the back. Thinking, all right, this is it, I started heading down the steps. But as I rounded the corner, what caught my eye was water. The entire basement was completely submerged. Honestly, I was disappointed, but at the same time, I judged that it was too dangerous to enter. So, I taped it off, creating a clear, no trespassing past this point, barrier like a makeshift police line. The building itself wasn't very large, so the consensus for the shoot quickly became, we don't need 3 people, 1 is plenty. And so, that older colleague, the one who had previously gone missing, was assigned to go in alone once again. Lugging all the cameras and equipment by himself, he stepped into the abandoned house. Right after that, the mudang arrived to meet up with us earlier than scheduled. At the time, we had already secured lodgings about 2 kilometers away from the abandoned house. So, we were taking a quick break in a relaxed mood, thinking along the lines of, let's grab a beer at the convenience store and unwind. Suddenly, however, the mudang's expression changed completely, and he blurted out, we have to go back right now. It was something to the effect of, an accident is about to happen. We need to get there this very second. With that, he threw on his jacket and bolted as if he were possessed. He ran with such intensity that it looked like he was going to sprint the entire 2 kilometers without stopping for a single breath. We had no choice but to push ourselves to the limit, panting and wheezing as we ran after him. The moment we arrived at the scene, the very first thing that caught my eye was the shredded police line. We're screwed, I thought. Without a single moment of hesitation, the mudang headed down first and waded straight into the water. A heavy splashing sound echoed, like he was grabbing hold of something in the water and hauling it upward with brute force. And the person he dragged out was that older colleague. He had been completely submerged under the water. Even so, he hadn't entirely lost consciousness. The second he was hauled outside, he coughed up a mouthful of water, wheezing, "Help me," while shivering violently from the freezing cold. Together with the mudang, we propped him up, practically carrying him on our shoulders as we scrambled out of there. The moment we made it back up to the surface, the mudang kicked the basement door with all his might and screamed, "Don't you ever dare come back out!" His voice carried a razor-sharp, genuine venom. Then, he vented his fury at the darkness, shouting, "What the hell do you think you're doing to someone who just came here to save people?" After that, he turned to us and said, "But it's a blessing in disguise that he hasn't been possessed. Let's get back to the lodging and get him warmed up." As we walked back toward the lodging, propping my older colleague up, we asked him, "What on earth happened in there?" He told us that while he was in the middle of filming, an old man had quietly approached him in the dead of night. The shoots usually began around midnight, so the mere appearance of an old man out in the mountains at that hour was deeply bizarre in itself. Supposedly, the old man said, "I heard human voices and saw some lights, so I got curious and decided to come take a look." My colleague didn't think much of it, assuming he was just a local resident from somewhere nearby. Then, the old man asked if he could terribly trouble him for a cigarette. When my colleague handed one over, the old man smoked it and just kept talking to him continuously. After a while, the old man apparently said, "Well, since you were kind enough to give me a cigarette, why don't you drop by my place for a cup of tea?" Even though a part of him thought, "Is there even a house anywhere near here?" He ended up following the man anyway, as if being pulled along by something. The next distinct memory he had left cut off at the exact moment the man opened a door and said, "This is my house." When he finally snapped out of it, he was underwater. The structure of that basement was laid out so that if you entered from the right side of the front face and turned left, you would be right at the exit. Because of this, my colleague said he was already well aware that there was water down there. Years ago, a TV show like Mystery Commando had handled a story mentioning that the basement was flooded. He explained that despite how cramped the basement was, the water sat as high as a person's waist, even when the water levels receded. During the monsoon season when the waters swelled, it could rise up past a person's height, or so the story went. He said he completely lost his sense of direction underwater. No matter how hard he thrashed around to find his way out, he couldn't tell left from right. It was exactly at that moment that the mudang grabbed his hand and hauled him out. My colleague mentioned that this was already the second time in his life that he had been taken away like this. The stories up to this point are already terrifying enough, but there is still more to it. After a shoot wraps up, people sometimes ask if we always perform a bibang, a shamanic ritual to ward off evil or an exorcism. It depends on a case-by-case basis. When we judge a situation to be genuinely dangerous, we perform them with absolute seriousness. Even though we made it back to the lodging safely, what if it followed us back? That is the exact anxiety that sometimes haunts us. The day I returned home after finishing the shoot in Yeongdeok, for some strange reason, I felt a bizarre, overwhelming craving for a drink. Normally, I would have passed out from sheer exhaustion, but my mind was completely consumed by the thought of alcohol. So, I stopped by a convenience store, bought 2 bottles of soju and some light snacks, and headed inside. That was when I noticed the older colleague I was close with waiting right in front of my house. He said, "Hey, open up for a second," and naturally slid inside with me. We set up a small table and started drinking. Right at that moment, my phone rang. It was the mudang. The mudang, his voice laced with absolute panic, yelled, "Hey, get the hell out of that house right now!" I just brushed it off, saying, "What are you talking about? Stop messing around," and hung up the phone. But the mudang called back immediately and barked, "Don't engage with it. Don't even look at it. Just get out of there this instant." At that exact second, that older colleague, the one who had been sitting right in front of my eyes drinking with me just a moment ago, was completely gone. It was only then that the terrifying truth finally hit me. I had been entirely alone from the very beginning.